A glossary. Deinstitutionalization, reinforcing the subjection of the mental patient by substituting psychiatric tutelage for psychiatric terror. Insanity plea, psychiatric alibi based on the scientization of Christianity. Evil deeds formerly attributed to demonic possession are now attributed to irresistible impulses or schizophrenia. Legal insanity, the disease caused by committing a crime and being caught. Its precipitating cause is the trial, its diagnosis is the verdict, and its treatment is incarceration in a hospital for the criminally insane. Medical model. When psychiatrists speak about the medical model for psychiatry, they mean one or more of the following propositions: that so-called mental diseases are proven or putative brain diseases, that regardless of what so-called mental diseases are, they ought to be treated as if they were brain diseases, that so-called mental diseases are medical problems, and hence only physicians, psychiatrists, ought to be allowed to treat persons suffering from such diseases, that because so-called mental patients are dangerous to themselves and others, and because they do not know what is in their own best interests, compulsory measures may legitimately be used to restrain and treat them. Psychiatric diagnosis, the psychiatrist's statement about the patient, useful for the psychiatrist. Psychiatric expert testimony, mendacity masquerading as medicine. Psychiatric nosology, a dictionary of defamations disguised as diagnoses. Psychiatric symptom, the patient's statement about himself, translated into psychiatric jargon, useful for the psychiatrist. Psychiatric training, the ritualized indoctrination of the young physician into the theory and practice of psychiatric violence. Psychiatrist, a person trained in medicine which he doesn't practice, practicing psychotherapy in which he is not trained. Psychiatry. 1. Conflicts without adversaries. 2. An ostensibly medical discipline whose subject matter is neither minds nor mental diseases, but lies. These lies begin with the names of the participants in the transaction, the designation of one party as patient, even though he is not ill, and of the other as therapist, even though he is not treating any illness. They continue with the lies that comprise the subject matter of the discipline, the psychiatric diagnoses, prognoses, and treatments, and they end with the lies that, like shadows, follow ex-mental patients through the rest of their lives. The records of denegrations called depression, schizophrenia, or whatnot, and of imprisonments called hospitalization. If we wish to give psychiatry an honest name, we could call it mendacitology, or the study and practice of lies. Psychohistory, the vilification of hated and glorification of loved historical figures, presented as the products of impartial psychiatric historical research. Psychopathology, problems in living renamed as mental diseases. Psychotherapy, the psychiatric mystification and management of problems in living renamed as treatments. Psychosomatic medicine, the medical philosophy according to which bodily diseases are mental and mental diseases physical. There are two kinds of psychiatry, voluntary and involuntary, contractual and institutional. To confuse them is like confusing ally and adversary, freedom and slavery. The crucial distinction between contractual and institutional psychiatry is being rapidly eroded. The psychiatrist's social mandate to control the patient, dangerous to himself or others, increasingly vitiates his effort, should he even want to make it, to serve as his patient's agent. Voluntary psychiatry is thus becoming an anachronism, while involuntary psychiatry, increasingly disguised as and confused with voluntary psychiatry, is becoming the medical legal standard for what constitutes professionally proper psychiatric practice. The relationship between the psychoanalyst and his client is exquisitely cooperative, between the psychiatrist and his committed paranoid patient, implacably antagonistic. These diametrically opposite therapeutic encounters are both subsumed within the boundaries of the same discipline. That psychiatrists expect the same physicians to practice both methods testifies to psychiatry's lack of professional integrity. That laymen accept the psychiatrists pretending to do so testifies to the non-psychiatrist's thoughtlessness about psychiatry. Institutional psychiatry is the result of the marriage of unemployables. The patients are unemployable laypersons. The psychiatrists, unemployable physicians. Having joined them in holy madness, the state blesses their union and supports those so united. Why does the state do so? Because by exiling patient and psychiatrist into the domain of mental illness and institutional psychiatry, society is enabled to contain both madness and mad doctoring. Institutional psychiatry thus fulfills a basic human need to validate the self as good, sane, by invalidating the other as evil, insane. This arrangement is at once the reason for and a consequence of the fact that mad persons and mad doctors have something crucial in common, namely, that neither is able or willing to perform services saleable in the free market. The madman produces complaints and self-neglect. The mad doctor contempt and constrains products unsaleable in the free market. There are, and can be, no abuses of institutional psychiatry, because institutional psychiatry is itself an abuse, just as there were, and could be, no abuses of the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was itself an abuse. The Inquisition was the characteristic and perhaps inevitable abuse of Christianity. Institutional psychiatry is the characteristic and perhaps inevitable abuse of medicine. War, said Randolph Bourne, is the health of the state. What did Bourne mean? That war is the ultimate raison d'etre of the state, the rhetoric of protecting the national interest, justifying a virtually unlimited extension of the size and scope of governmental activities. The sense of national emergency engendered by war transforms the destruction of dissident opinion into patriotism. Similarly, psychosis is the health of psychiatry. Why? Because psychosis is the ultimate raison d'etre of psychiatry, the rhetoric of protecting the patient's best interests, justifying a virtually unlimited extension of the size and scope of therapeutic activities. The sense of psychiatric emergency, engendered by psychosis, transforms the deprivation of liberty into hospitalization and therapy. In the Age of Faith, the scapegoat was defined in religious terms. He was the arch-sinner, the devil, the anti-God, the anti-Christ, the Jew as Christ killer, religious Christian anti-Semitism. In the Age of Science, the scapegoat is defined in medical terms. It is the arch-disease, the plague, the addiction, the Jew as pathogenic agent in the body politic, therapeutic National Socialist anti-Semitism. In the Age of Faith, the institution entrusted with waging the struggle against the scapegoat was religion. This is what made the Church the principal adversary of individual liberty, dignity, and responsibility. In the Age of Science, the institution entrusted with waging the struggle against the scapegoat is medicine. This is what makes psychiatry the principal adversary of individual liberty, dignity, and responsibility. Institutional psychiatry offers solutions to problems of housing by camouflaging them as problems of health. It defines some of the homeless as mentally ill, confines them in institutions called hospitals, and justifies forcible incarceration and decarceration as medical treatment. The latest obscenity in the long history of institutional psychiatry is the forcible eviction of the chronic mental patient from the hospital that has become his home. In the United States today, individuals who want to stay out of mental hospitals are still admitted to them against their will, whereas individuals who want to stay in such hospitals are now also discharged from them against their will. The result is that while the prison function of the mental hospital has remained unchanged, its asylum function has become progressively eroded. The doctrine of the right to treatment, enthusiastically embraced by self-seeking public interest lawyers in the 1960s, has led in the 1980s to the denial of asylum, deceptively called deinstitutionalization. Like the term mental hospitalization, the term deinstitutionalization is pure fraud, a euphemism disguising reality. The term mental hospitalization conceals the fact that it stands for a confused and confusing mixture of incarcerating persons who are unable or unwilling to take care of themselves, who may be offensive into the bargain, and persons who engage in violent and other criminal acts. The term deinstitutionalization similarly conceals the fact that it stands for a confused and confusing mixture of forcibly relocating persons housed in mental hospitals in other tax-supported domiciles under mental health auspices, and forcibly evicting persons housed in mental hospitals with the expectation that they will live on the streets. After the defeat of the Germans in World War II, we did not speak of the deinstitutionalization of Jews. After the defeat of the Japanese, we did not speak of the deinstitutionalization of Japanese Americans. These people were simply freed. The shackles imposed on them by their adversaries were removed, and they were restored to the same status, possessing the same rights and responsibilities as their liberators. So long as the self-styled psychiatric protectors of mental patients are unwilling to do the same for persons denominated as mental patients, that is, abolish civil commitment and the insanity defense, there can be no meaningful discussion either of how we might most effectively protect or how we might most appropriately punish individuals we now call insane. Why are Soviet psychiatric abuses abuses? Because they entail psychiatric interventions imposed on patients against their will. No, it cannot be that, because we, in the Free West, also impose psychiatric interventions on patients against their will. Is it because they entail imposing psychiatric interventions on persons against their will, even though the so-called mental patients are in fact not mentally ill? No, it cannot be that either, because the persons subjected to involuntary psychiatric treatments in the Soviet Union are mentally ill by Soviet psychiatric criteria, just as the persons subjected to such interventions in the United States are mentally ill by American psychiatric criteria. Is it then because we view some of the persons the Russians call schizophrenics as dissidents? Yes. We thus come down to the issue of legitimizing the particular application of abstract criteria for justifying psychiatric coercion, which vary, of course, depending on the legitimizer's interests and values, which is why involuntarily hospitalized mental patients typically consider their own confinement unjustified, but consider the confinement of other crazies justified. I myself spent 9 years in an insane asylum, wrote Antonin Artaud, and I never had the obsession of suicide, but I know that each conversation with a psychiatrist every morning at the time of his visit made me want to hang myself, realizing that I would not be able to cut this throat. On the other hand, Vincent van Gogh wrote, I am thinking of frankly accepting my role of madman, as Degas took the character of a notary. For the time being, I wish to remain shut up in an insane asylum, where I have to follow a rule, as here in the hospital, I feel at peace. Would patients other than psychiatric patients say such things? If the answer is no, does that not tell us precisely what we most need to and least want to know about psychiatry? When out of power, politicians promise to do good. When in power, they do well instead. Similarly, when they were out of power, psychiatrists promised to humanize medicine. When they gained power, they medicalized the humanities instead. Biological psychiatrists, firmly committed to the support of coercive psychiatric practices, assert that I dehumanize mental patients when I suggest that their delusions may be lies or pretenses. However, only human beings lie. Indeed, lying is a characteristic feature of the behavior of politicians, priests, and psychiatrists, individuals whose status as moral agents we never question. Hence, to place delusional mental patients in the same class with such respected liars acknowledges and affirms their humanity rather than denying or impugning it. To the psychiatrist, the patient's lies are delusions. In abolishing the lie, he abolishes language, and in abolishing language, he abolishes man, as C.S. Lewis warned that he would. A well-worn joke among psychiatric house staff goes as follows. We had a serious emergency last night. We had to commit God. Why? Because he had the delusion he was, name of the chief of psychiatry. If psychiatrists acknowledged what this joke at once reveals and conceals, namely that a person is confined in an insane asylum when he no longer knows his place, they could not, in good conscience, continue to practice psychiatry. The scapegoater accuses a person of a wrong he did not commit. The psychiatrist forgives and punishes him for it. In pre-Freudian psychiatry, sex was repressed. In post-Freudian psychiatry, power is. We often hear and read about escaped mental patients committing murder or suicide or engaging in other newsworthy activities. But who has ever heard of or read about escaped diabetes patients or escaped cancer patients doing such things? In the 17th and 18th centuries, when men like Hobbes and Jefferson talked about the church, virtually everyone understood that they were talking about politics, power, not religion, morality. Today, when presidents, governors, senators, and other politicians talk about psychiatry, virtually no one understands that they are talking about politics, power, not medicine, healing. My point is that English and American politicians assume, and are expected to assume, that the power of priestcraft is evil, and hence they oppose it, whereas they assume, and are expected to assume, that the power of psychiatry is good, and hence they support it. So long as this remains true, there can be no genuine psychiatric reform. The characteristic inconsistency and intellectual dishonesty of anti-psychiatrists and their followers, asserting that psychopathology, mental illness, is not real, literal, disease, but that psychotherapy, conversation, is real, literal, treatment. The characteristic inconsistency and intellectual dishonesty of ex-mental patients and their so-called liberation movement, rejecting the attribution of mental illness to a person in order to deprive him of liberty, but accepting such an attribution in order to excuse him of responsibility for his criminal behavior. Psychiatrists are in a hopeless fix. They cannot become honest professionals so long as they pretend to be physicians diagnosing and treating mental diseases. But if they frankly acknowledge that they are advocates and adversaries in human conflicts, then they cannot hope to be accepted as physicians. Talmudic scholars prefer studying and practicing the exegetics of God's Word to attending to man's humanity and inhumanity to man. Psychiatrists prefer studying and practicing the exegetics of DSM-3 to attending to what persons designated as mental patients and psychiatrists say and do to one another. The man who kills for his country and wants to avoid working needs only to say, "T cannot forget what I did in Vietnam." Immediately, psychiatrists rush to testify under oath that he is disabled by his memories and suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. The man who kills his countrymen and wants to avoid going to jail needs only to say, "T cannot remember what I did in Vermont." Immediately, psychiatrists rush to testify under oath that he is disabled by his lack of memory and suffers from dissociative reaction or schizophrenia or some other ominous mental illness. Cui bono. Advance a claim of remembering too much or too little, and presto, we are off to the psychiatric races. The first thing to remember about mental health policy is that we speak of policy only when goods and services are allocated by the government rather than exchanged in the free market. We speak of a policy for feeding Africans, but not for feeding African violets. As defense policy or foreign policy can serve only the interests of a collectivity, the nation, so mental health policy, too, can serve only the interests of a group and cannot serve those of particular individuals as they themselves would define their self-interests. Is it any wonder that the more we talk about mental health policy, the more tax monies we spend on mental health care, the larger our mental health problems grow? Psychiatrists now treat the same mental illness both with electrically induced convulsions and with anticonvulsant drugs, which is as if physicians treated the same disease with bloodletting and blood transfusion. This paradox is a paradigm of what counts in psychiatric treatment: not good sense, empirical proof, respect for the patient's consent, but the brazen imitation of doctors, sensationalism, and contempt for the patient as a person. Freud said that psychoanalysis helps the patient to exchange neurotic misery for ordinary unhappiness. Mutatis mutandis, organic psychiatric treatments help the patient to exchange ordinary unhappiness for the miseries of psychiatric cures. Formerly, priests burned men's bodies to save their souls. Today, psychiatrists imprison men's bodies to save their minds. Some people make bad jokes out of their lives. Others make bad jokes about them. The former are the psychotics, the latter, the psychiatrists. In the Soviet Union, there is no formal censorship of the press. It would be wrong to conclude, however, that the press is free. On the contrary, the censors write and publish the newspapers. A similar situation prevails in the United States with respect to psychiatric information. According to Louis L. Judd, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, the whole premise of psychiatry now is that profoundly disordered behavior is a psychobiological phenomenon. It manifests itself in behavior, but it's got to be related to dysfunctional mechanisms in the brain. This, of course, is merely a restatement in contemporary language of the classic belief of alienists that mental illnesses are brain diseases. Because all behavior must be related to the brain, the premise that disordered behavior is related to dysfunctional brain mechanisms implies that not disordered behavior is related to functional brain mechanisms. But this cannot be true because the human brain is essentially the same in different cultures. But what counts as profoundly disordered behavior is not. Surviving Spouse's Depression Studied announces a typical headline ballyhooing new psychiatric research. To understand the true nature of psychiatry, we need to do no more than realize and take seriously the absurdity and impossibility of a headline announcing Surviving Spouse's Elation Studied. Present-day psychiatric thought and rhetoric rest on three implicit assumptions. 1. That every kind of undesirable behavior, harmful to oneself or others, is an instance of mental illness. 2. That every mental illness is the result and symptom of brain disease, proven or provable by future medical technology. And 3. That every person afflicted with a mental illness is potentially a legitimate subject for involuntary mental hospitalization and treatment. Doctors control diseases, not persons. Psychiatrists control persons, not diseases. Superstition is to religion, wrote Voltaire, what astrology is to astronomy, the very foolish daughter to a very wise mother. Just so is psychiatry to medicine. Psychiatry is the sewer into which modern societies discharge their insoluble moral and social problems. As sewers pollute the waters into which they empty, so psychiatry, emptying into medicine, pollutes the care and cure of the sick. The business of psychiatry is to provide society with excuses disguised as diagnoses, and with coercions justified as treatments. As an old psychiatric joke has it, the neurotic builds castles in the air, the psychotic lives in them, and the psychiatrist collects the rent. I would add that the psychiatrist builds a profession and prisons on a metaphor, the neurotic seeks solace in them, and the psychotic is sentenced to them. Human beings exist in two states of consciousness, asleep and awake. Psychiatry may be used to make persons either more asleep or more awake. Chemotherapy, as well as psychotherapy, may either sedate or stimulate the patient, depending on the nature of the drug he ingests and the nature of the conversation in which he engages. The psychotic lacks personal self-esteem. Like Lady Macbeth, such an individual cannot, for good reasons, admire himself as a person. Hence, he must manufacture imaginary grounds for self-esteem or perish. The psychiatrist lacks professional self-esteem. Like a confidence man, such an individual cannot, for good reasons, admire himself as a physician. Hence, he too must manufacture imaginary grounds for self-esteem or perish. The psychiatrist knows he doesn't belong in medicine. That is why he became a psychiatrist. Finding that he now has no place to live, like the deinstitutionalized mental patient, he is eager to return to the institution. Thus do psychotic and psychiatrist fabricate their insane delusions and their mescal theories of insanity, each as fantastic as the other, each as impervious to refutation by logical reasoning or empirical evidence as the other. There are students who don't study and mothers who don't mother, but there are no patients who are not sick. The patient who has no bodily illness is considered to have a mental illness. With increasing zeal, psychiatrists insist that mental diseases are brain diseases. They do not seem to realize that the logical consequences of this claim are as inimical to the welfare of psychiatry as a profession as are the consequences of my claim that mental illness is a myth. Here is why. Neurology is the medical specialty devoted to the study, diagnosis, and treatment of diseases of the nervous system, brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves. Psychiatry is the medical specialty devoted to the study, diagnosis, and treatment of diseases of the mind, schizophrenia, depression, substance abuse, and so forth. If mental diseases are brain diseases, then psychiatry should be a part of neurology. And if scientific and judicial authorities would recognize this to be true, medical schools should teach neurology, but not psychiatry. Courts should recognize neurology, but not psychiatry. And the government and insurance companies should pay for the treatment of neurological illnesses, but not for the treatment of mental illnesses. Ideology, in Minogue's apt formulation, is a form of theoretical conscription. Everyone, by virtue of class, sex, race, or nation, is smartly uniformed and assigned to one side or the other. But Minogue omitted one of the most important contemporary criteria for classifying persons: mental health, mental illness. This is what I mean when I assert that psychiatry is an ideology. The ostensible agenda of psychiatry is diagnosing and treating patients suffering from mental diseases. Its real agenda is treating mental patients like criminals and criminals like mental patients, degrading both and depriving both of liberty and responsibility. Responding to criticisms of their practices, Soviet psychiatrists objected to the idea of including patients in treatment decisions, because in psychiatry and the rest of medicine, it is not the accepted custom in the Soviet Union to discuss with patients the methods for treating them, except for cases where the physician is the patient. Nevertheless, the Soviet psychiatric officials acknowledged that their laws need provisions for informed consent to treatment. Welcome to the Alice in Wonderland world of American-Soviet psychiatric relations. Critics of psychiatry who agitate for abolishing one or another psychiatric practice or the whole profession are even more dangerous enemies of individual liberty and responsibility than the psychiatrists they oppose. The scope of discrete psychiatric procedures, such as lobotomy, electroshock, or psychotherapy, is, after all, limited to those who voluntarily submit to them or can be coerced to be victimized by it. However, the abolition of any particular procedure limits the choice of every member of society and undermines the fundamental concept of the individual as a competent adult who can manage his life without the meddling of a protective state. Moreover, the demand to abolish, say, electroshock treatment replaces a legitimate object for state control with an illegitimate object for such control. It is the duty of the state in a free society to protect people from coercion and to leave them alone to enter into voluntary contracts with one another. Accordingly, the patient must be protected from the coercion of the psychiatrist, conventionally called treatment, and the psychiatrist must be protected from the coercion of the patient, conventionally called symptom. It is stupid to speak of involuntary psychiatric treatments when what we mean are psychiatrically rationalized assaults, or to speak of violent patients when what we mean are persons who commit violent crimes. And it is stupider still to constrain contract and hence abridge individual liberty and responsibility and claim to be doing so in an effort to combat violence. A free adult in a free society gets something because he wants it, is willing to pay for it, and finds someone willing to sell it to him. In contrast, a child gets something because he needs it, is willing to cry or beg for it, and finds someone, or more often simply finds himself in the presence of someone who is willing to give it to him. Patients, especially mental patients, rarely, if ever, get what they want, especially if they ask for it. For example, were a person to ask a psychiatrist or psychiatric hospital for room and board, for benzodiazepines or electric shock treatment, or to be discharged, he would receive none of these services. He would, however, get all this and much else were he to properly conventionally deceive the dispensers of services into believing that he, the patient, needs them or requires them. For example, if he threatens to kill himself or slashes his wrist and has the police bring him to the emergency room, he will receive room and board. If he complains of panic and sleeplessness, he will receive Xanax or Dalmay. And if he behaves as if there were nothing the matter with him and confides in confidence to a friendly nurse how he is ripping off the mental health system, he will receive a discharge. In short, there is a fundamental disjunction in the mental health system, and there has always been, between what the provider of services thinks the patient needs or requires, therapy, and what the recipient wants or requests, which may be being left alone by the psychiatric authorities or a service totally different from what the providers want to give him. The result is mutual manipulation, defense, and aggression, each party trying to get the better of the other. What is missing is collaboration and cooperation, precisely the ingredients in the absence of which it is a travesty to speak of therapy, much less decency and respect. The two necessary preconditions for the contractual non-coercive practice of psychiatry, the secular cure of souls. 1. abolition of involuntary mental hospitalization, repeal of all civil and criminal commitment laws. 2. Separation of psychiatry and the state, in particular, prohibiting the state from funding mental health services as it is prohibited from funding religious services. My psychiatric critics angrily accuse me of wanting to destroy psychiatry. But what is wrong with advocating a psychiatry in which the psychiatrist can't do anything to the patient, which the patient doesn't want done to him? The power of an idea whose time has come is said to be irresistible. Today, mental illness is such an idea. This is why I believe that the problem with psychiatry is not so much that psychiatrists have too much power, though they do. It is rather that the idea of mental illness has too much power given to it by the people who believe in it. Thus, only when people withdraw their blind faith in mental health and mental illness will they see fit to curb the powers of psychiatry, just as only when people withdrew their blind faith in God and the devil did they see fit to curb the powers of priestcraft. The kind of power psychiatrists now wield is similar to the kind of power priests wielded before the Enlightenment. It does not come out of the barrel of a gun held by an oppressor. It comes out of beliefs held by human beings who prefer to rely on mystifying symbols and paternalistic authorities rather than on themselves. Colleagues often tell me that they chose to become psychiatrists because they felt they were all screwed up and thought that it would help them put their heads on straight. They ask me why, since I am hostile to psychiatry, I chose to become a psychiatrist. I tell them because I felt psychiatry was all screwed up and I thought I could put its head on straight.